Good evening, everybody. Drumroll time, it's office hours time of the month again. Welcome along. Sing out on the chat line. I think I've just turned on chat for everyone. Apologies if you were trying to chat to me before we officially started. I forgot to enable chat for everyone. By default, it's all restricted. But sing out in the chat line if you can't hear me or you can't see me. In terms of seeing me, hopefully the quality of the video is a little bit better for those people who are attending live. What I've always done in the past is I've had my computer webcam do the Zoom element for the people attending live, and I've had a second camera recording it directly such that I could actually do something with something better than Zoom quality when it comes to putting these things out on YouTube. But I figured that was being rude to the people who take the time to come along and actually be part of the audience to actually then say, well, you guys get the dodgy recording. So I bought a special splitter which now sends the proper camera through both. Now, as you know, Zoom still generally mangles the video because it's trying to keep the compression there, but hopefully it's a slightly better experience. Hopefully I look a little less offensive to you through the joy of camera. Then again, a better camera might mean I look more offensive to you, but either way, hopefully it's a nice consistent experience for everyone. So let me fire out my slides and we'll get straight into it. Okie dokie. So once again, shout out if you can't see the slides or you can't hear me, etc., etc. So as is my want at the start of every month, a few little bits of administrative stuff, in particular for anyone that hasn't ever been on one of my office hour sessions before. First of all, getting in touch is easy. I've loved talking tech. I've got plenty of avenues via which you can get in touch with me. Rather than plunder you with them all, you can just scan the QR code or you just go to linktree/Connor. That'll give you links to my blog, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Mastodon, Twitter, YouTube channel, anything else I've got there, GitHub repo, email, podcast, what else, speaker deck, etc., etc. So anything I do that involves talking technology, hopefully there is a mechanism via which you can either see it or get in touch with me via there. The easiest way is probably by Twitter. My DMs are always open because I like talking about technology. I will apologize in advance. I'll probably do some coughing and spluttering and blowing my nose tonight. I'm not sick, but I made the mistake of having a hot chili meal earlier on this evening, and it just absolutely destroyed my sinuses. Lovely meal, but yes, I went a little bit overboard on the chili. As I said, if you're new to my office hours, the slide content generally is pushed down to the left or the bottom of the screen such that when we turn it into YouTube, my face won't cover up any valuable content for you. So it'll just look a bit weird because most of the stuff doesn't fill the screen because we want to make sure that we don't hide any content from you when it comes to making it into a recording. Standard bits, I spend 5 or so minutes doing some bits and pieces, predominantly revolving around user groups because I'm a big fan of the user groups. I used to be involved in them and now I'm a champion for them, even though I work for Oracle. Coming up soon, the Croatia HROUG user group event in terms of the call for papers is finishing. I think the original call for papers finished today and they've extended it by a couple of weeks. So you've got till June 30th now. That event is at the end of the year and there's a whole stack of events in Europe around that time frame. So if you get along to that and you're based in Europe, then you'll be able to get along to others as well. So please submit for that one. Coming up, East Coast Oracle user groups. They had a really tough time during COVID, so I'm a big fan. I've been there a couple of times in the past. I'd love to get back there, but East Coast of US is pretty much diametrically opposite the side of the earth from Perth, where I live. So it's always tough to get there for me, but if you live closer, then please get along to that. Closer to me, though, the AUSUG conference, Australian Oracle User Group. They haven't had an in-person event for the last few years due to the obvious reasons, but it's back. It's back this year, so we'll be having events in Perth and Melbourne. So if you're in the APAC area, anyone from India watching the call tonight, or Asia, please see if you can get along to the AUSUG events. And obviously, if there's anyone in Australia watching the call tonight. Kscope starts next week, probably one of the biggest Oracle developer conferences going around outside of, say, Cloud World and some of the other big user group events. But yeah, Kscope starts next week, next Wednesday. I've got, I think, 7 presentations to give there, so I'm going to be busy. But if you are in Kscope, go to the Kscope. If you're joining us from America tonight, thank you for getting up very, very early. But also, if you are at the Kscope event, what I'll be doing is throughout the week there is I'll regularly be tweeting when I'm going to go grab a coffee. If anyone would like to join me, just follow me on Twitter. And literally, if you're at the Coast Cup event, when I tweet out, let's grab a coffee, and you want to have a coffee, come along, let's have a chat. You don't have to have a chat, but I'll happily buy you a coffee because, it's great to be finally back amongst the community. What else is coming up? Next month, as in about a month's time, I'll be going to India for the Yatra tour. That's 6 cities in about 7 days. Absolutely lots of fun and games, incredibly busy, fantastic community there in India. We typically get over 1,000 attendees across the tour. So it's a fantastic event. Shout out to Sai who runs that. So that's coming up. If you're in India, same thing. Come say hello, grab a selfie. That would be awesome. What else is coming up? Cloud World. I mentioned Cloud World last month as well. I put it in here again, because obviously you can register and go along. That we'd love to see you there. But more importantly, they've actually done a sort of a pre-release of some of the sessions we expect to have. So if you go to the Cloud World site now, you can actually browse the session catalog for things which are unconfirmed but probably going to be there. So if you want to see what the kind of content that's going to be there, one of the nice things is, and this was the same as last year's Cloud World, we had a huge amount of tech content. Everyone say, it's Cloud World, it's just going to be marketing hype. We had a huge amount of tech content last year, especially tracks for developers, special tracks for DBAs. So looks like we're doing the same again this year. So get along to Cloud World. It'll be cool. All of which is me just saying, as I always do every month, please, wherever you are in the world, endeavor to support your local user groups whenever possible, because user groups build community, community builds success, and success helps all of us. That's the key here. Okay, final bit of plugging for my own content. I've just released another episode of my podcast, and this one's going back to basics, and it's on database locking and the concepts of optimistic and pessimistic locking. So if you're back into basics and internals, please check out my podcast. That one runs for about 30 minutes. If you have ideas for podcast topics or people you think I would like to speak to or you'd like to hear me speak to in the Oracle community, please reach out and we'll see what we can do. My dog is under the table and he's nibbling on my foot. So, there we go, he's off. So what are we doing today? We're hopefully going to try cover 8 topics if we can. There's a message in the chat. I'm not paying attention. Chili is healthy for the sinuses. I don't know. As you watch them drivel out here, you might be so excited by them. So what are we talking about today? 8 topics to try get through. Easier lob facilities, and I'll also spruce a little utility I wrote which hopefully will help anyone that deals with multimedia in the database. Manual SQL profiles, which tables I should shrink, converting from long to the supported CLOB and blob format, order of predicate evaluation in SQL statements, what is internal function when we see that in our execution plans, which are the busiest tables on my system, and how do I do a hierarchy with a count. Plenty of demos, hopefully lots of fun, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. Okay, I'm gonna run out of water. As always, sing out in the chat line. I'll do my best to try keep an eye on it. It's down to the right on my screen, so I'll do my best, but sing out in the chat line on the Q&A as we go, and I'll do my best to cover it off. Easier lob facilities. And one of the I suppose, the sad things that came a couple of releases ago was in 19C, we said the multimedia option, which a lot of people used to use. You may be familiar with the schema called ordsys in your database that used to be installed there. We de-supported the multimedia option. And the vast majority of reasons for that was to do with licensing and open source library support, because it used a lot of Java libraries, and some of those were no longer being maintained in the open source community, which means they were susceptible to things like security issues, and therefore it just wasn't worth the risk to maintain that repository inside the database. So that's a bit of a downer, and there are various commercial tools out there in order to replace that. There's, I think, the Apex Multimedia Engine, a very good tool used here at Oracle as well. So I thought, well, I could write my own multimedia engine, because it's very easy to write a blob out to a file using util file. It's easy to call operating system utilities that do media manipulation. I use a tool called FFmpeg. It's free, it's open source, and it can do pretty much anything to a video or a image. It's amazingly powerful, just runs on the command line. And if I can write the blob out to file, run my OS utility on it, and then read it back read my amended or changed or new blob back from the file into the database, voila, a multimedia engine for free, not particularly sophisticated, but hopefully something that you might find useful. So let's fire up a demo to show you that, and then we'll get into the fact about why I called this topic Easier Lob Facilities. I hope I called it Easy Lob. So I'm going to create a sequence. This is just some background and a table called T, which has a 1 column B of a blob. I'm going to load a blob into it. So let me do a fresh share. This is what I'm going to load into it. This is my dog Bailey. It's a picture, so that's bailey.jpg. That's the one I'm going to load in. So you know what the image looks like as the starting point. Let's now continue on and see what we do. So first I've got to get it from the file system. That's just a picture of my dog on the file system into the database. So you can see I've created the temporary lob. Here's where the file is. It's in the temp directory. It's called bailey.jpg. And I'm simply opening it up, loading it in, and inserting that blob into my table called T. So that has my table T now has 1 row of a picture of my dog. This is the multimedia engine, I use the term loosely, I wrote to allow us to manipulate images easily, hopefully without having to worry about licensing, buying commercial stuff. And if you'd have fairly rudimentary requirements, this should do the job for you. So the first thing, I've got this multimedia engine. It takes in a blob, it's going to take in a picture of my dog. It's going to return a new blob out, and I can pass in these various parameters, which are the kind of things I want to pass to my command line utility. Do I want to rotate the picture? Do I want to shrink it, expand it, change the color, etc., etc.? So that's basically the main part opening there. So the first thing I need to do is, if I've got a blob in the database, in this case, a picture of my dog, I'm going to read it out of the database and write it to a temporary file somewhere on the file system so that OS utility can actually access it. And that's what I'm doing here. I simply open up the blob, find its length, and I'm simply using UTL file in its binary mode to simply write out 32K at a time, because typically media files are quite large. 32K is the largest UTL file can do at one go. I'm just writing out my binary blob in 32K chunks out to the file system. I'm also going to write out a second file using UTL file, which simply says a flat file here, which is going to consist of the list of parameters that I've passed in. So whether I want to rotate the image or shrink it, all the parameters that I need to pass to FFmpeg will go to a separate file as well. Then one of the cool things I can do is I can take advantage of an external table, not to read anything from the file system, but an external table has a preprocessor option, which lets me call utilities on the operating system. So I'm actually not using the external table to query anything. I'm using it simply to get access to an operating system command. And one of the nice things with external tables from 19 onwards is I don't even have to predefine it. I can literally do the whole definition on the fly in a select statement. So in this case, I'm doing select from external. I've got this FFmpeg name here. It's just an arbitrary column. I don't need anything with this data. The key thing is here, I'm going to actually run this little batch file on my Windows machine, which runs the FFmpeg routine, and I'm passing in that list of parameters so it can see it. If I spit out that little batch file, not that I'm by no means a Windows batching expert, I could have done this in shell script as well on the Linux machine, is all it's really doing is looking in this file, the file I pass in, which has the list of parameters. It contains the file name I'm meant to be processing and the parameters I'm meant to be doing it, and I call my FFmpeg routine and write it out to a brand new image file on the operating system level. Once I've done that, I now need to bring that file I just created on the operating system back into the database so it all looks seamless to the person that called it. They never knew that we went out to the operating system and back. And so I create a new blob, load up my new file, and then load from the blob, and I'm done. So there's my procedure. Thankfully it created. Let's give it a go. So I'm going to create another table here called T1 with a blob. So I'm going to take that image in table T, which was of my dog. I'm going to load it up, make a change to it, and then save it into T1, this new table. So here's an example of how this routine works. I'm going to get my blob from T, the original picture of my dog. In fact, I can kill off the old picture of my dog. Original picture of my dog. I call my multimedia engine, and these are the parameters I could pass into this operating system routine. In this case, I've said I want you to take the video component, in the case the image, I want you to flip it horizontally and flip it vertically as well, which basically means I've turned it upside down and flipped it around, and save it into this new blob, which I'm going to store in my table called T. And there you have a multimedia engine with all the power that comes with the FFmpeg routine at the operating system level, which is huge. Did it work? Well, here's the length of my new blob from my table T1, so at least something's in there. Is it valid? Well, to do that, I have to write it out to the file because this was all designed to be database-based. So let me now take that blob and write it back out to a new file. I've called it Bailey Flipped. And let's see what it looks like. And let me share that. And there we go. It took that image, turned it upside down, flipped it left to right as well. And so my multimedia engine looks like it's working just fine. Now, the source for that is on my blog. Feel free to go get it. You can use it. As I said, if you do the occasional bit of media, the occasional bit of media manipulation, e.g. you have a requirement to simply take images and create thumbnails from them, then it's very easy with FFmpeg just to simply shrink an image down to any particular size. Google for FFmpeg, it's an amazingly powerful little image and video manipulation routine, and now you have access to it straight from the database. Now, all of that is really background for this particular topic, which is easier lob abilities, easier lob capacities, because as you saw in a few examples of that source code, this is how I loaded a binary file from the operating system into the database. This is a script I've had floating around in my little library forever. This is how I've always done it. I create a temporary blob, effectively pick up a new B file name, and then I simply go, yep, okay, load it up, file open, load the blob from the file. We used to have a thing called load from file, but now it's load blob from file with some offsets, etc. And when I did that, the first comment that came in on my blog post about this, someone said, what the hell? Why is that so complicated? Didn't you know there's a much, much easier way? And I was unaware of this. If you want to load a blob from the file system into the database, the toBlob command takes an overload of not just raw files, but obviously B files as well. And I never knew this. So if you want to get a file from the operating system into the database, you don't need util file, you don't need dbms load blob from file with all these parameters and getting the length, etc. You can literally do toBlob, round a B file, directory name, file name, and the job is done. Literally that simple. And as we see, I've loaded up my Bailey file and it's 6 megabytes in size. So funnily enough, hopefully you've got some benefit out of my multimedia engine, because that's the ideal here. I think anyone that wants to do multimedia manipulation can do that very easily now with just one little simple routine and the FFmpeg tool, which is free. But also it reflects the fact that this is why community and user groups are great, because I put things out in my blog and people say, here's a much easier way. And I get to pass that on to you, which is, look at this, so cool, so easy now to get blobs, or I should say binary files from the operating system or anywhere outside the database into the database just with a one-line command. Super cool. That's number one done. Number two, predicate order. Here's the question that came in. Can I influence the order of predicates in a SQL clause? For example, if I had column greater than 0 and square root of column equals some value, how can I make sure that the positive number check is done? Let me try that again. Then how can I make sure that the positive number check, column greater than 0, is done first? Because if there were some negatives and we put that into a square root, then that would fail. So we want to make sure that the column greater than 0 is done first and not the square root function. And sadly, the definition of how predicates are evaluated is indeterminate, because once again, we're in relational algebra here, we're in set theory. It's not like we can read the SQL statement and apply them in a particular order. So what do? Let's look at some examples of how we can work around this issue and some commonly thought of examples that might not work as you may have thought. So I'm going to create a table called T as it's a copy of DBA objects, about 80,000 rows. I'm going to put that one bad row in there. So the object ID, which is always positive in the data dictionary, I'm going to add an additional row with an object ID of -1. And we can see it's got some tags there saying this is a bad row. So here's the question that came in effectively, or here's an example of that. I'm going to do a count from T where the object ID is greater than 100,000 and the square root of the object ID is between 1 and 10. Now, if we encounter that row with the -1 in it and apply a square root to it, then we're going to have a problem. So what does the database do? Well, it worked. Fantastic. Yeah, and we think, oh, fantastic. Obviously, the database is smart enough. It knew that these two parameters, these two predicates must be related in some way. It looked at them and said, object ID greater than 10,000. I must do that first, otherwise square root is going to fail. That sounds great. And so into production, this code goes. And then I say, okay, well, obviously 100,000 is some parameter that people, the users can pass in. So what if they pass in 0 and it falls over? All that stuff I just said, saying the database was smart enough and knew how to do it, is fiction. There is no preset order to the way that predicates are run. If you're a dinosaur like me, you might remember way back in the day with the rule-based optimizer, predicates were evaluated from the bottom upwards. But no such rule exists in the cost-rate optimizer, and correctly so, because it's set-based theory. The order is meant to be indeterminate. That doesn't help us here. So maybe if we do it this way, from a semantic perspective, this looks like it'll solve our problem. The inline view says, yep, first go get all the values of object A greater than 0. That eliminates the -1 value that we had in our table, and then wrap that in an inline view, and then apply the square root. But the database, unfortunately, is too smart for us. We have a thing called query transformation. The database comes in and says, yep, okay, I'm going to take this complex query, which has an inline view, and try fold it back into a single query before I optimize it, because that gives me the best chance of coming up with the best execution plan. And so we didn't solve our problem. What if I do a no merge hint? Well, no merge isn't explicitly designed for inline views of this type. It's really designed for things like subqueries, push subquery predicates, etc. So even a no merge hint, unfortunately, still has the same problem. So we seem to be a bit stuck here. Maybe if I take the part I want to run first and move it out into a common table expression or a with clause, I can do with position or with positives as get all the rows where object E greater than 0, and then do a query against this positive table. Doesn't work. Same problem. The database says, there's your complicated query. Let's try fold it all in together to make sure it's going to run nice and efficiently, and therefore the order is once again indeterminate. Maybe if I add the materialize hint, what materialize says to the database is, let's take that part in the brackets, the with statement, actually create a temporary table with that result, and then use that as my query. So what happens there? Doesn't work there either. The reason is the database is smart. What it's doing is it says, okay, yes, I will do that transformation. I will load a temporary table, but hey, I can make that temporary table actually more efficient by grabbing the square root clause and jamming it in there at the same time to make my temporary table transformation more efficient. And we're back to the same problem. So what do? Well, one option which works and has worked for a long time, but I'm not a huge fan of, is this one, where if I add a row num predicate into a with statement, and typically inline views as well, then that tells the database, well, the only way I can apply that is to run this in isolation. I couldn't fold this predicate in there as well, because that would change what the row num result would be. So because of that row num presence, I must run this first and must store it in isolation to a temporary table without doing anything else, and then I can apply the square root function, and that works. So you can do that. My only concern with that is that's because the database currently says this is a limiting factor. I can't fold predicates in because there's a row num clause. Who knows what will happen in the next version of Oracle? Who knows what will happen when the optimizer patches come out? We might find a way of optimizing around this. For several versions, this has worked and people do rely on it, but there's no guarantees here. So there is a hint which used to be documented and is no longer documented called ordered predicates. And the ordered predicates hint said we will apply the predicates in top to bottom order, in the order that they are listed. And as you can see, for this particular example, the ordered predicates hint works. Now, if it works and it solves this problem and the hint's still there, why the hell isn't it still documented? Well, we took it out because it doesn't really work. It works in simple cases like this, but the database has evolved a long way since this hint was first introduced. And therefore, it becomes something that can confuse people easily. For example, what if I do something like this? Select count object name where object ID greater than 0 and square root this. I now put it in brackets and linked it with an and. Doesn't work. Doesn't solve it by having those brackets. What does work though is if I use a case statement, because case statement has a thing called short circuiting. And what a short circuit says is if this is true, I don't need to go, if this is false, I don't need to go past this point, because false and anything is always false. So if this is false, I can stop right now, and therefore I don't need to chug along to this area. So I'll never hit that square root function. In this case, it works. And so a case thing has this short circuit ability where it says the moment I run out of conditions that by definition already gives me the answer. Is the answer definitely false? Is the answer definitely true? I don't need to evaluate the other expressions. So this is one way of doing it to make sure that only when the object ID is greater than 0 that we actually will fall through to this second condition. So a case statement can be done along those lines. I would probably prefer to write it something like this, where rather than having the case statement just return a Boolean, it would actually, the case statement would return some effectively expression, and the expression is then compared to a set of range of values, because then I could make that a virtual column and put an index on it should I need to. So that would then keep it nice and fast as well. I'll just do a couple more examples, then I'll get to the chat that's come in. Back to that ordered predicates hint. Why, I sort of waved my hand and said, yes, yep, you can't use it, you can't rely on it, but didn't really justify that. Let's put an index on the object name. So if I use ordered predicates here, as the hint would suggest, I do this first, which means I'm going to hit that -1 for sure, because it's going to fail. Then I'm going to do that second, because ordered predicates, and then this one third. That's how the expression will be run. Therefore, this query will definitely fail, but it doesn't. So it broke the rule. It didn't do ordered predicates. Why? Well, I haven't got the execution plan here, but it used the index on object name. And this is why we had to remove ordered predicates, because things like this, which you would say, okay, based on the hint, that query should fail. Now it works. The fact that the query works is a wrong result, because if we obey the ordered predicates direction, it should mean that that should fail. We should get an error from that query. And by result, you can imagine the opposite is also potentially true. A query that works when you put ordered predicates in now fails, even though by definition, the query, any query should always return the same result no matter what you do. And that's why ordered predicates really just isn't sustainable. Chat line. Okay, Eunice is saying there are lots of hints that are still undocumented, but the big gurus know them all. That's true. Let's, did I put this? Along that same sentiment. Yes, there are lots of undocumented hints out there, which people still use from time to time. But there's a reason we call them undocumented, and that is they might disappear, they might work in different ways from release to release. And as I said use the short circuit in case statements here rather than using row num, because the optimizer changes with every single release. So if you use undocumented hints, or you use undocumented assumptions, things like row num, well, you're sort of taking that risk, you're taking that responsibility for knowing that just the next RU you might apply, the next version you might upgrade to might break all that code. So better to use stuff, for example, the case short circuit, which is guaranteed to work as you roll through the evolution of the Oracle database. Internal function. Speaking of undocumented, if you go through the documentation, you will not see any list of functions of one called internal function, which leads to this question. I have a table with a timestamp, and when I query it with sys timestamp, the execution plan's the execution plan, should we try that from the top? I have a table with a timestamp, and when I query it with sys timestamp, the execution plan shows internal function. What does this mean? Now I'm going to have a rant, because one of the things that always catches people out is when you mix and match data types. We've seen that thing where people compare dates to strings, they compare numbers to strings, they compare strings to numbers, and they always end up with drama in the Oracle database. Things like the break or things run slow, and we keep saying, this ain't JavaScript. we have data types here. We have data type integrity. Make sure you use the right data types and don't mix and match them. That's the end of my rant. Now, of course, this is not a rant of this particular person because they're using timestamps with sys timestamp. So what could possibly be wrong? Let's explore. So I need a timestamp column. So I'll create a table. I'm simply going to take the sys date and convert it to a timestamp. So we have a timestamp column. It's got 1,000 rows in it. And let's now do select from that table where the timestamp column is greater than sys timestamp, just like the question that came in. And as the person said, you end up with this bizarre thing, internal function. Plus it's wrapped around sys extract UTC, which I think is actually documented. It extracts the UTC part from a timestamp. But the question is why? What is all this stuff going on when I'm comparing a timestamp column with sys timestamp? That doesn't seem right. Well, let me throw back to the classic time-honored problem of here's a varchar2 string and I try to do a comparison to a numeric. What happens in the execution plan? The database invisibly added 2 number. Why did it do that? It had to make sure that the thing on this side of the equation was the same data type as this one. Now we don't want to mess around with this one, and so we touch effectively. We don't want to mess around with 12, and so we put a 2 number around that one. Really couldn't do it the other way, because if you put a 2 char around here, then it depends on things like your territory settings, your language settings, and all that kind of stuff. And therefore you might get the wrong result. You really have to put the 2 number around here in order to get a consistent result. But to bring the data types into alignment, we had to apply a function to it, which gives you a clue. The fact that we're doing internal function means that maybe we have a data type mismatch. Let's see. If I do that timestamp from that table and I dump the timestamp, it says the data type is type 180. That's the internal number for the timestamp data type. If I do the data type for the sys timestamp, it's type 188. And that's the difference. They are different data types. Now the big question is why? Why is a timestamp and sys timestamp different data types? Well, if you do auto trace only explain, if I take sys timestamp and convert it to a timestamp, even though it seems like it's already a timestamp, then you can see this works fine. There's no longer internal function, no longer conversions, etc. Why is this the case? Because sys timestamp is not a timestamp. Sys timestamp is a timestamp with time zone. It's a different data type. What you do want to do if you're storing timestamps in the database without a time zone, you want to compare them to timestamp expressions that also do not have a time zone. For example, local timestamp is just a data type 180. No function comes in there. That's the key thing. We're so keen to use sys timestamp because we're so familiar with sys date from all those decades of Oracle use, but be aware sys timestamp is a timestamp with the addition of a time zone component, whereas just a normal timestamp is not. And that's why we have those internal functions. And there's a whole stack of other reasons why you might see it. The most common reason, however, is a data type conversion. So be aware of that. If you see internal function, it probably means you've got a data type conversion going on, and therefore you want to maybe have a look at the code. As I've said, timestamps and time zones are generally just tricky. If you are building applications that use timestamps and they're going to be used globally, my advice is do what we do on our cloud, which says you've got a database, we're storing UTC. That's the easy way. If you need to store time zones as well, fine, but make the base database clock of your system UTC. It solves a whole lot of hassles. I will do one caveat there is you can see internal function for valid reasons as well. Sometimes if the list of predicates is too complicated for explain plan to display, it will take that combination of predicates and simply say, yep, I did a whole lot of things with some predicates, I did an internal function. So it's not a guarantee you've always got a data type mismatch, but it's the most common reason. But so I suppose the really thing is if you see it, have a double check of the code, make sure things are actually all correct from a data type perspective. Busy segments. I need to identify which tables in my system. I need to identify which tables are busiest in my system so I can look at tuning them. Is this tracked anywhere? I'm going to show you something funny here. Believe it or not, we do track it, but back in the day, 21 years ago, in Oracle 8, we didn't. And so there was a competition held by a company called BMC, which they said, you can write us an essay telling us how you would do it without this information that we have today. And if you win, you got to go to open world. And so, yeah, I submitted an essay. That's me 21 years ago. I had a bit more hair then. I looked, I looked a little less damaged then as well. I lived a hard life. But yeah, so way back in 2002, I won a competition to go to open world, my first ever open world, because I could identify which tables were busiest without the tools I'm going to show you right now. So to answer this question, I've said yes, but, and we'll get to the but stuff later on, but to answer the question first, let's do a quick demo. I create a table as a copy of DBA objects, table called T. It's got 80,000 rows. What I do want to know about this table is the object ID. So if I go look at user objects, I can see the object ID is 118128, and I've stored that in a SQL Plus variable called object number. It's useful for me because we have a view in the database called $segstat. And what it does is it captures information about every single segment in the database. So what we do need is the object number. And if we've truncated the table, we need the data object number. That varies as we go, but I'm just using the object number because I've just created this table. If I know that, I can query $segstat. Now, what's in $segmentstat? If I do distinct statistic name, we capture all this really cool stuff. How many logical reads has a segment done? Buffer busy waits, DB block changes, physical reads, the list goes on. All these things that we used to only collect at session level, we now collect at a segment by segment level, making this task very, very easy. So as I said, we know what the object number is. I've simply pumped it into here, and it says, in the creation of this table, I've done 2,400 logical reads. I've done a few block changes to build it. What else have I got? Physical reads none. I haven't queried it yet, etc. So if I query the table, and let's run it a few more times. So I've run that query. That's several full scans of the table. This table's small enough to fit in the buffer cache. What do I get? The logical reads has jumped up. This table's so small, I'm not doing direct path reads. Otherwise, I'd probably see it in the, where are we? In the physical reads direct. Table's so small, I didn't need it. But I've done no block changes. My logical reads has gone up. My physical reads has gone up as well. So these are the kind of things I'm doing with a full table scan. If I delete some rows from the table, then yes, I can now see I've done 3,700 block changes. I did a whole lot of logical reads as well because deletes have to read the data before it can be deleted. But as you can see, $segstat is a fantastic way of tracking for every single segment all these amazing attributes that might be useful to tell you which are the busy segments in your system. This is cumulative, so what you might want to do is maybe use your AWR reports or take snapshot yourself to show deltas over time. Now, I've put the but in here, and we'll come back to the but in a second, but just to reinforce, this is $segstat, so the stats we gather are statistic name. I wanted to put it here so I could highlight the ones you're probably going to be looking at, which is DB block changes. How many times are we making modifications to data? Logical reads, generally indicator of high CPU. Physical reads, you're working your IO subsystem. Physical reads direct if you're doing big table full scans. So it's in there. Also in the same database, you'll see a view called $segment statistics, which is the exact same data, but it's a bit nicer. It's the owner, the object name, the table space name, etc. Now, I didn't do the demo with this view because querying this view is much more expensive. If you come in on the object number, we can go directly into that structure. If you come in on the owner and the object name, we effectively have to do you can think of joining DBA objects to $segment stack. They can be two very big objects and it can be quite expensive to do so. So if you're looking just for certain objects, I would look at $segstat. If you're capturing the whole copy of everything that's involved in the system, same thing, I'd copy $segstat and maybe a copy of DBA objects from time to time. But querying segment statistics aggressively can be quite expensive on your system, but it is there, so I thought I'd better mention it. Now the but part, yes, you can see what segments are busy, but what does that really give you? Generally, the only reason you're interested in busy segments is your system is being seen as your whole system is being busy. It's not segments that cause busyness in systems, it's SQL. So rather than go looking at VLOSEGStat to say, oh yes, that table there is very, very busy, what really is the only reason that table is busy is because SQL is busy using that table. And you can't take a table and say, let's make it less busy. You can only make a table less busy by modifying the SQL that is running against that table, or finding the SQLs that are concerned, and if necessary, modifying the table design, but it starts with the SQL. So just for completeness, what you want to be looking at is VLOSQL, really, for things like disk reads, buffer gets, CPU time, elapsed time, etc. And as we all know, I say this often when I go to office hours sessions, we should use VLOSQL stats instead because it's more scalable, doesn't take latches, and you can query this much more aggressively to find out the SQLs that are hurting your system, because if you fix them, the segments will no longer be hurting your system either. We're making reasonable progress. I know I'm talking fast, I'm going hard, which is probably killing the chat, but we're getting plenty of content through. Hierarchy count. I can use connect by to get the standard hierarchical listing from my table, but how can I get a count for each row of all the subordinates under each entry in the hierarchy? So this is a straight SQL question, but it covers some interesting concepts in our Oracle SQL knowledge, so I thought I'd give it to you tonight as well. Let's use the time-honored classic hierarchy Scott.emp table, or just the emp table in my local schema here. And I'm sure everyone's familiar. We simply start with a point in the hierarchy. We have a definition of how we're going to get from one entry in the hierarchy to the next, to the child or the parent, depending on which way we're traversing it. We have the level pseudo column, which lets us know how deep in the hierarchy we are. So if I use some padding, I get this lovely picture of my hierarchy, and that works just fine. Connect by, believe it or not, was even in the very first version of the Oracle database. So even along with select came connect by way back in Oracle version 2. That's how old that facility is. The question is, I want to be able to put a hierarchy count next to each person. So 13 people report to King because he's the CEO, and there's 14 people in total, so 13 people must report to him. What do we got? 4 people must report to Jones, etc. Now, I could do it this way with a scalar select, which is, here's my hierarchy as before, which gives me all the results. For each row, because I'm doing this sub-select not as a join, but actually as a scalar select, it's a select in the select cause or the list of columns. For each row, run a count star doing the same hierarchical traversal. So in this case, on this row, I'll start with King, traverse the hierarchy and find that he's got 13 people. Then I get to Jones, traverse the hierarchy, find that he's got 4 people, and so on. People at the very bottom of the hierarchy have no subordinates. And that works fine. But if I do gather plan statistics on that query to see how expensive is it, when we look at the execution plan for that cursor, the key thing to look at here is the starts column. I scanned the employee table once to do my first connect by, to give you my base hierarchy. But when I got those 14 rows, then for every row that came back, I ran the same query again to start from that particular person and drive into the hierarchy. You can see the starts here. I ran that scalar query 14 times, once for every single row, which means if I have 10,000 employees, I'll be running that query 10,000 times, and so forth. Sometimes scalar querying can get some caching, but by definition here, every single row of the hierarchy is a different set of rows or different evaluation. So I'm going to run this into thousands and thousands of starts. That's going to be expensive. Maybe I can avoid scalar queries by using some of the cool stuff that came in later versions of Oracle in terms of joins, in this case, for example, lateral. What lateral lets me do is reference entries in the outer table in my join table as if they were correlated, like correlated subqueries. So in this case, I'm starting with the employee table as before to get my base level hierarchy using the standard connect by. Then I'm using a lateral to do a select count by, but lateral lets me reference columns across the two join tables. So in this case, I can, even though it's a join, I can say, yep, grab this element from the other table in the join. That's what lateral lets me do. And I get the same result. Is it better from an execution perspective? Because now it's just one join to another join. If I do gather plan statistics to see what the results are, unfortunately, no. Yes, we did the one start through the employee table, but as you can see, we ended up doing a whole stack of starts through different levels of the hierarchy. So lateral works, but we didn't really get a performance benefit. It's blazingly fast with 14 rows. It won't be blazingly fast with 14 million rows. So I was trying to tackle this from a different perspective, which is if I can start with the rows like this, my base level hierarchy, and have a way of always bringing them out in this particular order. Order siblings gives me this much, but if I'm going to have this as sort of some raw data to use some additional work to try work out the count, I want to be able to produce the results back in this order again, even though I've lost the connect by when I use this later down the track. So I added a row number sequence just using the row num. That gives me the hierarchy now, plus this nice unique ascending number, which I can use for ordering later on. Now, if I look at that result, how do I work out the count? Given a particular entry in the hierarchy, the definition of count is I keep looking down levels while the level number is higher than the one I'm currently on. So if I start at level n, which is in this case level 2, I keep traversing this hierarchy in this order until I hit another 2. So as long as it's greater than 2, I know that person's a subordinate, that's a subordinate, that's a subordinate, and so forth. That gives me a count of 4. So these are the rules I need to apply. For every time I start at a particular level, keep looking down the rows until I get to the level, or in fact, while the level is greater than the value of 2. Now, that there is establishing a pattern via which I can apply to these rows. And if I have rows and I have patterns, then of course I have pattern matching queries. So as I said, here's my raw data. That is that data we just saw. The hierarchy with a row num added to give me some sequencing. Then I'm going to use some pattern matching. And what the pattern I said, we start at a particular level. Doesn't matter what level we start at, so it can be anything. And then I have an arbitrary number of higher levels. And the definition of higher level, as the name suggests, is the level I'm on is greater than the level I started with, as we saw in the previous slide. If I start with 2, I keep going until I get to a number, or I keep going while there is a number greater than 2. I've left out the measures here. I just wanted to focus on the pattern and the rules here. Now I need to add some measures. The measures are, each time I hit a starting level, in this case, level at someone 2, I'm going to print out their name, print out their employee number. And then what I do, the only thing I need to add is the count of all the people that had a higher level underneath. And that's going to give me my subordinate count. So if I run that, it works. Fantastic. King has 13 reports. Now, I seem to be missing something here, as you can imagine. And what pattern matching does by default is it says, yep, start with the row name King. His level is 1. The rule was keep going while the level is greater than 1. Yep, keep going. Okay, we're done. Now we start the next from this position here. Oh, we're done. We've finished the whole table. That pattern matching is completed. And that's why we only got the one row, which obviously isn't the result we're after. But pattern matching lets us do this clause as well, which is it doesn't matter how far I scanned ahead to fill the pattern. When I finish filling the pattern, go back to the next row from the one I just started with. So I add that clause, and there we go. There's my subordinate count using pattern matching, not using scalar queries or lateral. That's all well and good as an exercise in SQL, but is it more performant? Let's throw our gather plan statistics hint on there and see what happened. How many starts do we have? One scan through the table. And all the rest was done with the magic of pattern matching. So yes, pattern matching will obviously burn some CPU, but one thing it's going to do is give you one pass through the table, no matter what the size is. We can infer that hopefully from this small example. So pattern matching is one of those great facilities where it can be applied not just to, I'd say, let's call it all the cliched patterns that we think about. There's always opportunities there to find patterns in the standard business rules that we come up with in our databases. How we got? 9:51. We might get a couple more in. Okay. Manual SQL profiling. I'm just going to shrink this window back a bit. Sorry. What am I sharing? My slideshow. I know. Good. Here's the question that came in. I've been dabbling with SQL profiles, and they seem to generate a whole stack of hints. Can these hints be used in isolation, or are they special to SQL profiles? Now, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to start off with an apology. And on behalf of Oracle, when it comes to things like SQL profiles, it's been a bit like this. Anyone see that TV show called Wheel of Fortune, where they sort of spin the thing and there's all these possible things that might land on? Well, this has, I suppose, been a little bit the same when it comes to some of our SQL tuning options in the past with Oracle. We had outlines, and then we had SQL outlines, and then we had SQL profiles, and then we got SQL tuning sets, and we got SQL plan baselines, etc., etc., etc. As the little turntable there suggests, SQL plan baselines is pretty where you want to be. It's where we've ended up on through all this history. But the reality is people are still using SQL outlines and SQL profiles. But if you are, I'd recommend you go to baselines. But as a result, I thought we'd cover two of the historical versions because that's what the question was about profiles and outlines. So yes, in both cases, they are just hints, but I've put the just there in quotes because they're special kind of hints that we need to treat with some care. Let's do a demo. So I'm going to create a table called T. It's a copy of DBA objects, so it's about 80,000 rows. That's going to have stats on it because create table of select does stats of about 80,000 rows. But then I'm going to insert another 800,000 rows, all with an object name of Y, and an object ID of all nines. So strongly skewed data, 800 extra thousand rows that the optimizer doesn't know about because stats haven't been calculated. And let's throw an index on the object name column. So if I do gather plan statistics for all the objects greater than this with the object name of Y, what happened? The database used an index because it didn't know that I jammed in 800,000 of these things. It's almost the entire table. And you can see it thought it was going to get 13 rows back, but it actually got 825,000 rows back. This disparity screams out of us that, yes, we have a problem here, which normally needs some tuning. So what are the kind of things that we could do? Well, if I tweak that SQL to do a full table scan, in this case I haven't, if I grab any SQL and tweak it or do any kind of manipulation with it, or I have an SQL that I like and I want to see what the list of hints would be to lock that plan in place, display plan and display cursor can take a format of plus outline. And it gives you the same plan, but also it gives you this thing at the bottom, which is very cool because it's actually in hint format. I can literally take that, cut and paste it into my SQL, and that gives me a complete set of hints that'll lock in that plan that we just saw, even though in this case it's a bad one. So anything you see here, you are totally allowed to use. Even if some of these things don't appear in the documentation, because they are part of an outline, you are welcome to use them because they've been generated as a set of hints that you can use. So you're welcome to use those as an outline. Now, I deliberately made the SQL bad in terms of the optimizer statistics are way out of date, so we could also do a tuning task. So I'm going to create a SQL tuning task on that SQL ID we just saw. Let's run it. And because it's bad stats and therefore a bad plan, this is going to come up with some recommendations for us. That's why I deliberately tweaked the example. So if I do report my tuning task, we get all this output that comes out. We can scroll through it. It's got, bits and pieces that talks about bad stats and things we could change, etc., etc., etc. But it also says I could have created a SQL profile for you to make things better, most probably a full table scan. So it actually says, yeah, here's an option you might want to consider. Or maybe this one, for example, an option where you might want to create an index on a different combination of columns. This is all a result of a SQL tuning set. The hints that come out of here to apply a SQL profile are different. So to find them, you have to go drilling into DBA advisor rationale, DBA advisor recommendations, and it's the @5 column, which sort of suggests, gives you an idea that maybe these things weren't meant to be exposed. So if you chose to accept a SQL profile, behind the scenes, we're doing these kind of hints locked into the SQL profile to make sure you choose the plan that you like. So these hints are a bit different in the sense that they're not generally exposed. Some of them are documented, the vast majority are not. However, having said that though, let's see if they would actually work. One of the ones you saw there was opt estimate. So let's do, for example, a table called T as a copy of DBA objects, brand new table. How many rows have the owner of sys? The optimizer thinks there's 2,200. There's actually 54,000. So the optimizer stats are wrong. Therefore, we could use, for example, the opt estimate hint to say in the query, first query in this select statement, of which there's only one, for the table called T, scale your estimate of rows that match this predicate by a factor of 24. You thought there was 2,000. I know there's 54,000 or 2,300, I think. I know there's 54,000. That's about 24 times your out by. So if I say, please scale the rows by 24, there we go. The optimizer thinks there's now 24 times as many rows, which is an accurate representation. Now, before you race out and say, great, I'm just going to jam all this kind of stuff into my queries, there's a big difference between using and using supported things. Yes, you can dig around inside the DBA views and find the internal hints that SQL profiles are going to use. But if you don't see them in the list of documented hints in the documentation, then officially you're not meant to use them. And even if you're using outline hints, even some of them might not appear in the documentation. I think the motivation there is, for me, the correct number of hints in an application is 0. Yes, you can use hints as emergency options, as emergency triage. That's why that outline hint comes in a hint format. But they're triage, they're for emergencies. You look at solving the root cause problem. In this case, I just needed to regather statistics. And for the second problem where I had when I put 900,000 columns in there, for the second one where the number of rows for the column for the value of sys was incorrect, I just needed a frequency histogram. Look for the root cause to solve so you don't need hints. Hints are a band-aid while you search for the true solution. And once again, just to reiterate, SQL profiles, SQL outlines are all still currently supported, but in reality, I know from the Optimizer group, in particular Nigel Bayless, fantastic resource if you want to reach out to him, SQL plan baselines are where we are heading. They are pretty much the future. So if you need to do things that lock plans into place, that's where you want to be focusing your efforts. Hopefully the video was nicer today. Hopefully the content you enjoyed, and more importantly, every last few months, I've always run about 5 minutes over. Not tonight. We have finished at 9:59 my time, so 1 minute up to the hour. Thank you as always for coming along. I'll hopefully be back next month. I'm not sure. I might be in India for the Yatra tour, but I'll keep you posted. I'm off to Kscope in a few days' time, so please, if you're in the States and coming to that event, please come say hello. Let me buy you a coffee. Anywhere else in the world, thank you once again for your attendance. Hope you found it all very much useful. As always, reach out to me on Twitter if you have any questions or comments, things you'd like to see in the next office hours. But until then, as always, support your local user groups, and we'll see you in next month's office hours. Bye for now, everybody.